Hello, today we're going to talk about setting up a charity in Hong Kong. This is something I've been asked a few times recently, so I thought I would set out a few of the basics. So today we're going to talk about what is a charity, especially specifically to Hong Kong legislation, some example purposes of that, some example structures and my preferred route, and then the practical steps to actually getting this done. So agenda, first of all, what is a charity? Well, first of all, it must be established exclusively for a charitable purpose. And that definition of charity has been defined in case law, and I think this was back in the kind of 1700s, 1800s. Principally, it's the relief of poverty, the advancement of education or the advancement of religion, and other purposes of a charitable nature beneficial to the community not included above. Now that last one sounds like a catch-all, it can be whatever you choose, but in reality it still has to meet a test of being charitable. And for Hong Kong purposes, whilst the first three might be global, so relief of poverty for people in a different continent would be acceptable, but the last one, other purposes, those may only be in Hong Kong. So an example of the other purposes may be to promote health or to promote sport. Well, that has to be, in general terms at least, specific to Hong Kong operation. So some examples of the purposes that we see are charitable. A lot of these are quite obvious. Relief of poor people, relief of victims of a particular disaster, the establishment or maintenance of non-profit schools, provisions of scholarships either to those non-profit schools or indeed to profit schools or similar, spreading the knowledge of a particular academic subject, and if the activities are geographically centered on Hong Kong itself, we can talk about specific items such as the release of sickness, disabilities, prevention of cruelty to animals, environmental protection and action, and the general promotion of good health. Those all typically fit the requirements of what is charitable. Now, some things that are not charitable, actions that go for a specific political purpose, items that benefit the founder or donors, etc. Items that seem to be tailored towards a specific company or industry. So the provision of a playing field or a scholarship fund for people that just work for one company, or even as broad as in a specific industry, those wouldn't be considered charitable because they are not for the general public or the greater people as such. And interesting activities specific to individual sports. So a charity that talks about sport in general, that would be charitable. One that specifically promotes one sport, say cricket, that would probably not be charitable, although something that perhaps promoted ball sports or water sports, one could argue that may indeed be charitable because that is a broader purpose. The key is the charity must be established for public benefit. One can't set up a charity for a very small proportion of people. I think especially if those people are not representational of the public as a whole. So to set up a charity for the ex-executives of the top 10 listed companies in Hong Kong probably wouldn't meet the realms of being charitable. But to set up a charity for people sleeping on the street, even though that obviously that's not the public as a whole, that would benefit the public as a whole, and that would be seen fairly well by the IRD when they came to do this. So here are some quick kind of points on it. The benefits must be very clear. This is what the charity is going to do, and we have to be specific on that. The benefits are related to the purpose of the charity. So this is all the optics and the writing. Everything makes sense and goes together. If the charity is to promote good health, then some of the benefits wouldn't be a scholarship fund or a discount on something not related to good health. Any harm must be outweighed by the benefits. It should be directed to the public as a whole or a sufficient section of the public. And if we're talking about certain sections of the public, it shouldn't be unreasonably restricted by geographic or other limitations. So we shouldn't be putting in things like income barriers, or you have to live in this certain part of Hong Kong in order to benefit by this, or at least those should be reasonably restricted. The beneficiaries should also be appropriate for the charitable purpose, and I personally think this is a way of ensuring that the ultra wealthy don't have their children, their dependents, as beneficiaries of a charity they set up in order to shield themselves from tax. So the beneficiaries should really be needing this charitable purpose. Any benefit other than a beneficiary receives should be incidental. So the other people involved in this process should not be getting significant benefit out of their operation with, their donoring, their interaction with the charity. The prime purpose of the charity is for its beneficiaries, no other purpose. The choice of structure. The most common that we see in Hong Kong, first of all, is a trust, secondly is a society, and then lastly is a limited by guarantee company. There are some other ways as well. There are other forms of organization that can be founded in Hong Kong. These are the three that I see. The last two I'll focus on. A society is essentially an organization of people. I find that can be troublesome to set up, and whilst it's very inexpensive, the ongoing compliance is a little bit easier than the limited by guarantee company as well. It does require a lot more form filling and specifically police approval. So this tends to be a more complicated way of getting it set up. And indeed, there is no liability limitation enshrined within it. A limited by guarantee company, often called an LBG, I see as more common, especially if the charity is going to operate for a period of time and not just be a one-off event. A limited by guarantee company is very similar to a normal limited company. However, instead of having shares, it has guarantors, and it's very important that it doesn't have shareholders, and essentially it doesn't make distributions, etc. And we'll get onto that on the next few slides. Now, as part of the application process, the IRD will look at the governing instrument. Now, when we talk about the LBG, this is the memorandum and the articles. So we need to ensure that those governing instruments precisely state the objects and the purpose for the charity. So relating this back to the prior couple of slides, you have to be very certain on this is what you're going to do and be very specific about it to the extent that you can. So, if you're helping poor people, you would say that. You would say, we're going to help this class of people. You might choose to be even more specific on that and say this particular demographic, this particular segment of society. Importantly, we have to limit the application of its funds towards attaining its stated objects. So in layman's terms, the money that comes in needs to be used to achieve the object of the charity. Now that's not, it must all go out to the beneficiaries, but the vast bulk of it, that's where it should go. The income and property, etc., should not be distributed amongst its members. And this is an advantage of using an LBG over a limited company. The limited company has no members as such, so there can't be distributions. We make sure this is stated very clearly within the memorandum and articles. On a wind-up, nothing goes to the members. So in fact, and that's the fifth point on here, I think, if there is a dissolution, where do the proceeds go? The easiest way to deal with this is to say it goes to other charities. And I personally would name those charities and then say, or any other such charity, as the liquidator may determine if the above, no longer exist or not appropriate, etc. The fourth point we have on here is prohibiting members of the governing body. So these are directors, the executive committee, the governance committees, etc., should not receive remuneration. Now, there are some exceptions here. So, obviously you have some very big charities in Hong Kong and they will have a CEO who will be paid or may receive other benefits. So they may have company housing, for example. You can justify that if you can say, this charity involves such a size or such a complexity that we need to hire someone to do this work, and this is how we are going to pay for it. If this charity is a one-off event, then I think that would be very hard to justify that you need to pay a group of directors, a chairperson, etc. So that will be case by case, but you really will need to justify strongly why any money should be used to pay the people who are running the charity. Then lastly, and this is common with most structures, sufficient books and records. So essentially accounts, and that should include very careful documentation of where the money has gone from. It's probably worth noting at this point, over the last few years in Hong Kong, the various anti-money laundering rules have been tightened up, and significant donations, you should have a very clear idea of where that money came from, and be very sure of the source of that, and that it's not indeed terrorist financing or sourced. So next, the actual profit tax exemption. So the Inland Revenue Department, which is the tax authority in Hong Kong, can exempt an entity from profits tax under what's called Section 88 of the IRO. This Section 88 is a term coined around, and when you talk to consultants and lawyers, etc., it's Section 88 that they'll often refer to. It's this exemption they're talking about. This exemption is, moderately complex. It becomes much more complex if the charity is conducting a trade or a business. And so rather than just fundraising, perhaps it has a hotel, and that hotel is a charity, and it is actually selling rooms and such like. Or it is buying materials and then sufficiently manufacturing and changing them, assembling 5 parts into 1 part and then selling that. Those start to sound like trades or businesses, and the exemption becomes more complicated in that case. The key is we have to show that all profits are applied to the charitable purpose, and also importantly that expenses are not spent outside of Hong Kong. So a charity that received $100, say, in donation, and that was to buy, let's say, a teddy bear, and the teddy bear was assembled from parts exclusively from overseas, and that was $99. That doesn't sound like a charity at all. So the application, well, the organizations need to submit an application letter to the IRD for Section 88. There's various attachments that need to be included. The principal ones here are of the various statutory documents, so the certificate of registration, certificate of incorporation, etc. A certified true copy, and that's important. It can't just be a generic copy. It has to be certified as a true copy. If the LBG hasn't yet been formed, it can be a draft of the governing instrument and the rules governing its activities. This is all the information we spoke about before, about specifying the purpose, ensuring monies can't be paid to the directors, the beneficiaries, etc. One would also want to give a list of activities planned for the next 12 months, some kind of diary. I typically say to people do that for 18 months because this process may take a while. And I think that also shows good intent of what you're trying to do and achieve. And those activities you should go into enough detail that the IRD can understand what you're doing. So what are you doing? Where are you doing it? Are there going to be sponsors? Who is it targeting? How's that money going to be raised? Where is it going to be spent, etc. And if you have been up and going, then a list of activities that have been carried out in the past and a copy of accounts. Once all the paperwork is in, generally it's an 8-week process. I've seen that go longer, and often the clock is partially reset if they have to come back and answer questions. So it's very important to make sure you give quite a full stack of documents, and I strongly recommend you have a detailed contents page and cover letter explaining where the IRD can find the information that they need. The actual practical steps forward then. First of all, make sure your charity is a charity. Make sure it meets the terms of what a charity is in Hong Kong. And if in doubt, the IRD will actually talk to you about this if you've taken the steps to draft a document and similar. The setup of a company limited by guarantee is not pro forma. This is not a quickly buy it and do it cheaply. It actually needs quite specialized advice to ensure that the memorandum and articles include all of those terms required so that you can get your Section 88 exemption. Do not undertake any transactions until the status is granted. If you fundraise before the status, there is a very strong risk it will be taxed as income. Once you know what you're doing and you're happy this is all going to be accepted, you can set up the LBG and apply for the exemption. One thing I've added on here, because I've heard it mentioned a few times by clients and friends of clients, do not mix bank accounts. So, if you're waiting for the bank account to be opened, even if your Section 88 is granted, do not, raise sponsorship through a different company and have the money paid into that company. That will be seen as income in that company and potentially would be subject to taxation, even if, yes, you might then be expensing it across straight away. You have to be patient and you have to do this very, very right. Hong Kong considers the charitable exemption, the Section 88, a privilege, and you need to respect that and make sure that everything you do ticks all the boxes required. That's it. As always, any questions, please feel free to get in touch. Thank you very much.